What you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about reality itself. These aren't fictional tales or urban legends. These are classified testimonies from active and retired police officers who've witnessed events so disturbing, so impossible, that they've spent years questioning their own sanity. Detective Marcus Chen from Chicago PD still checks his rearview mirror obsessively, not for traffic, but because 3 years ago, his partner's patrol car vanished mid-conversation, and dispatch claimed that partner never existed. Officer Sarah Delacroix from New Orleans can't enter certain buildings anymore because she spent what felt like 20 minutes inside a house where a family aged backwards before her eyes, only to discover she'd been missing for 72 hours. Tonight, 9 officers break their silence, sharing encounters that were too impossible to file in official reports, too terrifying to discuss with their families, and too real to forget. These aren't stories about catching criminals. These are testimonies about moments when reality itself became the perpetrator. From temporal loops that trap officers in endless cycles of horror, to evidence rooms that exist outside space and time, to radio calls from officers who died decades ago, each case will leave you questioning the very nature of existence. Before we begin, I need to warn you. Once you hear these testimonies, you'll never look at law enforcement the same way again. You'll never trust that your reality is as solid as you think it is. If you're brave enough to confront the impossible, then subscribe to XYZE Terminal right now, because we're the only channel bringing you these classified encounters that others are too afraid to share. Hit that notification bell, because these officers trusted us with their darkest secrets, and trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why. Hey, still sleep with the lights on? Let's dive into the first case that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world around you. Let's move to our first story, and I want you to listen carefully, because what Detective Marcus Chen experienced on that freezing February night in 2021 defies every law of physics, every principle of reality that we hold dear. Marcus had been with Chicago PD for 12 years, working the night shift in District 14 on the city's west side. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail, his calm demeanor under pressure, and his absolute reliability as a partner. These qualities made what happened to him on Interstate 290 all the more terrifying, because Marcus Chen was not the type of man to hallucinate, to panic, or to fabricate stories. It was February 18th, 2021, at exactly 2:47 a.m., when Marcus and his partner, Detective James Rodriguez, received a routine call about a possible drunk driver weaving between lanes on I-290 westbound near the Ashland Avenue exit. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees Fahrenheit, and the roads were slick with black ice that made every response call potentially lethal. Marcus was driving their unmarked sedan, while Rodriguez handled communications with dispatch. They'd been partners for 3 years, had worked hundreds of cases together, shared countless meals, and had developed the kind of professional rhythm that only comes from absolute trust and familiarity. As they approached the location, Marcus spotted the suspect vehicle, a dark blue Honda Civic with a damaged rear bumper, just as described in the call. The car was indeed weaving erratically, sometimes drifting into the shoulder, other times crossing the center line into oncoming traffic. Marcus radioed their position to dispatch, while Rodriguez activated their emergency lights. The standard protocol was simple. Execute a traffic stop, assess the driver's condition, and proceed with either a field sobriety test or immediate arrest, depending on the severity of impairment. But as Marcus began to position their vehicle behind the Honda, something impossible happened. Rodriguez's voice came through clearly on the radio, calling in their approach to dispatch. But when Marcus glanced to his right, the passenger seat was empty. Not just empty. Completely, utterly vacant, as if Rodriguez had never been there at all. The radio continued crackling with Rodriguez's voice, professional and calm, updating dispatch on their speed and position. But Marcus was alone in the car. Marcus's first instinct was logical. Perhaps Rodriguez had somehow fallen out of the vehicle, though that was mechanically impossible, given that they were traveling at 60 miles per hour on a locked highway. He immediately pulled over to the shoulder, his hands shaking not from the cold, but from a terror he couldn't yet comprehend. He grabbed his radio and called for Rodriguez, but dispatch responded with confusion. Unit 1447, there is no Detective Rodriguez assigned to your vehicle tonight. You've been logged as a single-unit patrol since the beginning of your shift. The impossibility of the situation began to crystallize in Marcus's mind, like ice forming on his windshield. He had clear, vivid memories of Rodriguez getting into the car at the beginning of their shift 6 hours earlier. He remembered their conversation about Rodriguez's daughter's basketball game, about the new Italian restaurant on Taylor Street, about their plans to grab coffee after handling this drunk driver call. These weren't vague recollections. They were sharp, detailed memories with sensory components. He could recall the exact scent of Rodriguez's cologne, the sound of his laugh when he told a joke about their sergeant's new haircut, the way he drummed his fingers on the dashboard when he was thinking. Marcus reached for his phone and scrolled to Rodriguez's contact information, but when he pressed call, he received an automated message stating that the number was not in service. More disturbing still, when he checked his recent call log, there were no calls to or from Rodriguez. Not just from that night, but going back weeks. His text message history with his partner, hundreds of conversations about cases, shift schedules, and personal matters had vanished completely. It was as if James Rodriguez had been systematically erased from Marcus's digital life. Desperate for confirmation of his sanity, Marcus contacted dispatch again and requested they run a personnel check for Detective James Rodriguez, badge number 4721. The response came back negative. No officer by that name had ever been employed by Chicago PD. Furthermore, when Marcus provided Rodriguez's physical description and asked if anyone matching it worked in District 14, dispatch informed him that no such individual existed in their system. Not transferred, not retired, not terminated, simply non-existent, as if he had never been born. The drunk driver, meanwhile, had continued down the highway and was now miles away, but Marcus found himself unable to focus on the original call. He was experiencing something that challenged the fundamental nature of reality itself. To test his own sanity, he drove back to the district station, knowing that other officers would have seen Rodriguez, would be able to confirm his existence, would help Marcus understand what kind of breakdown he might be experiencing. But at the station, Marcus's terror deepened into something approaching existential horror. He approached Sergeant Williams, who had supervised both Marcus and Rodriguez for 2 years, and asked about his partner's whereabouts. Sergeant Williams looked at Marcus with genuine concern and asked, "What partner?" "Marcus, you've been working solo patrol for the past 8 months. Are you feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus insisted that Rodriguez had been his partner, that they'd worked together just hours earlier, that Williams himself had assigned them to joint patrol duties. But Williams pulled up Marcus's duty roster on his computer, and the records showed an unbroken pattern of single officer assignments, dating back to June 2020. More unsettling, when Marcus asked other officers about Rodriguez, they all responded with the same blank confusion, as if he was asking about someone who had never existed. The psychological impact began to manifest physically. Marcus felt his chest tightening, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The fluorescent lights in the station seemed too bright. The familiar sounds of radio chatter and keyboard typing became overwhelmingly loud. He was experiencing symptoms of a panic attack, but underlying the physiological response was a deeper horror. The possibility that his own memory, his own perception of reality, was fundamentally unreliable. To prove to himself that Rodriguez existed, Marcus remembered that they had worked a homicide case together just 3 weeks prior. The shooting death of a convenience store clerk on North Pulaski Road. The case file would contain both of their signatures, their joint interviews with witnesses, their collaborative investigative notes. But when Marcus accessed the case file through the department's digital system, he found only his own signature on reports, his own interview notes, his own evidence logs. Every document that should have borne Rodriguez's participation showed only Marcus's work, as if he had been the sole detective on a case that required 2 officers. The most chilling discovery came when Marcus requested security footage from the station's internal cameras. He asked to review footage from the beginning of their shift, expecting to see himself and Rodriguez walking into the building together, suiting up in the locker room, discussing their patrol route. Instead, the footage showed Marcus arriving alone, talking to himself in what appeared to be a one-sided conversation, laughing at jokes that no one else had told, responding to comments that no one else had made. For hours of footage, Marcus appeared to be interacting with an invisible companion, and everyone around him acted as if this was completely normal. The footage revealed something even more disturbing. At one point during their shift, Marcus was clearly visible having what appeared to be an intense discussion with empty air in the passenger seat of his patrol car. His hand gestures, his facial expressions, his body language all indicated that he was engaged in a serious conversation with Rodriguez about a case they were working. But the passenger seat remained empty throughout the entire exchange, and Marcus appeared to be responding to silences, nodding at statements that were never made. Agreeing with suggestions that were never offered. Marcus realized that he had to consider 2 equally terrifying possibilities. Either he was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown and had been hallucinating a partner for months, or reality itself had somehow been altered, and Rodriguez had been retroactively erased from existence. Both explanations challenged everything Marcus understood about the nature of consciousness, memory, and the stability of the physical world. The psychological evaluation that followed was thorough and inconclusive. Marcus showed no signs of schizophrenia, no history of hallucinations, no indicators of substance abuse or neurological damage. His cognitive function was normal, his emotional responses were appropriate to the situation, and his memory was sharp and detailed in all areas except those involving Rodriguez. The department psychologist was baffled by the case. Marcus was experiencing what appeared to be a highly specific and consistent false memory system that had no clinical precedent. What makes Marcus's case even more disturbing is that he continued to receive what he believed were communications from Rodriguez after that night. Text messages would appear on his phone from Rodriguez's number, even though that number was supposedly non-existent. The messages were contextually appropriate, referencing current cases and department gossip that Rodriguez couldn't possibly know if he didn't exist. Security cameras never showed Rodriguez, but Marcus would sometimes find coffee cups on his desk that he didn't remember buying, case notes written in handwriting that wasn't his own, and evidence bags labeled with initials that matched Rodriguez's signature. Marcus took early retirement 6 months after the incident, unable to continue working in an environment where his most fundamental perceptions couldn't be trusted. He still lives in Chicago, but he's developed obsessive behaviors around verification and documentation. He records every conversation, photographs every interaction, and maintains detailed logs of his daily activities because he can no longer trust his memory to distinguish between what actually happened and what he might have imagined. To this day, Marcus Chen cannot explain what happened to James Rodriguez. He cannot reconcile his vivid, detailed memories of their partnership with the complete absence of any evidence that Rodriguez ever existed. He cannot understand how an entire person could be systematically erased from reality while leaving only one person's memory intact as proof of their existence. And perhaps most terrifying of all, Marcus cannot escape the possibility that if Rodriguez could be erased so completely, so thoroughly, then anyone could vanish from existence, and only one person might remember that they were ever real at all. The case remains open in Marcus's mind, the one mystery that will never be solved, the one question that will keep him checking over his shoulder for the rest of his life, wondering if the people around him are real, or if he's still sitting alone in that patrol car on I-290, talking to empty air and slowly losing his grip on reality itself. Let's move to our second story, and I need you to understand that what Officer Sarah Delacroix encountered in the French Quarter challenges not just our understanding of physics, but our most basic assumptions about time itself. Sarah had been patrolling the historic district for 7 years, and she thought she'd seen everything the old city could throw at her. She'd responded to voodoo rituals gone wrong, investigated supposed hauntings in centuries-old mansions, and dealt with tourists who claimed they'd encountered supernatural phenomena in the shadowy alleyways between Royal and Bourbon Streets. But nothing in her experience, nothing in her training, nothing in her understanding of reality could have prepared her for what happened on the night of October the 13th, 2019, at 1247 Dauphine Street. The call came in at 11:43 p.m. as a standard domestic disturbance. A neighbor had reported shouting, glass breaking, and what sounded like furniture being thrown around in the second-floor apartment of a narrow Creole townhouse that had been built in 1847. These calls were routine in the quarter, where the combination of alcohol, tourists, and the general wildness of New Orleans nightlife created a steady stream of noise complaints and domestic disputes. Sarah had responded to dozens of similar calls at similar addresses, and she expected this one to follow the familiar pattern. Separate the parties, de-escalate the situation, maybe make an arrest if someone had been injured, or if property damage was extensive. The house itself appeared completely normal from the street. It was a typical French Quarter structure, 3 stories tall with wrought iron balconies and weathered brick walls that had absorbed nearly 2 centuries of humidity, hurricanes, and human drama. The shutters were painted a deep green that looked almost black in the amber glow of the street lamps, and Spanish. Moss hung from the ancient oak tree that grew in the narrow courtyard visible through the carriageway. Sarah had passed this house hundreds of times during her patrols, and she remembered it as unremarkable among the architectural treasures that lined every block of the historic district. But as Sarah approached the front door, she noticed something that made her pause. The brass address numbers, which should have read 1247, appeared to be backwards. Not upside down, not sideways, but perfectly mirrored, as if she was looking at them through a reflection. She blinked hard, assuming it was a trick of the lighting or fatigue from working a double shift, but the numbers remained reversed. More unsettling, when she looked at her patrol car parked at the curb, she could see the house reflected in her windshield, and in that reflection, the numbers appeared normal. Sarah knocked on the door, and when it opened, she was greeted by a woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s, with long auburn hair and wearing a blue cotton dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade. The woman's name was Marie Thibodeau, and she seemed relieved to see a police officer. Marie explained that she'd been having an argument with her husband, Jean-Baptiste, about money problems, and that things had gotten out of hand when he'd started drinking heavily and throwing dishes. She invited Sarah inside to speak with Jean-Baptiste and hopefully resolve the situation peacefully. The moment Sarah stepped through the front door, she experienced a sensation she would later describe as walking into a photograph negative of reality. Everything in the house was reversed, as if she had stepped through a mirror into a world where left was right and right was left. The staircase that should have curved up and to the right instead curved up and to the left. The kitchen, which she could see through an archway, had its sink and appliances arranged as perfect mirror images of what they should have been. Even the family photographs on the mantelpiece showed people who appeared to be facing the wrong direction, though their expressions and poses seemed completely natural. Sarah's police training had taught her to observe and document unusual details, but what she was seeing challenged her ability to process visual information. She tried to rationalize what she was experiencing, thinking perhaps the house had been designed by an eccentric architect, or that she was suffering from some kind of optical illusion caused by the antique mirrors that decorated the walls. But as she moved deeper into the house, following Marie toward the living room where Jean-Baptiste was waiting, the reversed nature of everything became impossible to ignore. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau was sitting in an armchair with his back to the door, and when he turned to face Sarah, she experienced her first real moment of terror. Jean-Baptiste appeared to be elderly, perhaps in his 70s, with deep wrinkles around his eyes and silver hair that was thinning at the crown. But Marie, who had introduced herself as his wife, looked decades younger. Sarah had seen age-gap marriages before, but something about this felt fundamentally wrong, as if she was looking at a relationship that violated natural law. As Sarah began to ask routine questions about the disturbance, she noticed that Jean-Baptiste's speech patterns were strange. He would start sentences in a normal tone of voice, but by the time he finished speaking, his voice would sound younger, higher in pitch, more energetic. His physical appearance seemed to shift subtly as he talked, his posture straightening, his facial expressions becoming more animated, his movements becoming more fluid and coordinated. Sarah initially attributed this to the dim lighting and her own fatigue. But as the conversation continued, the changes became undeniable. Marie, meanwhile, was experiencing the opposite transformation. As Sarah watched, Marie's auburn hair began to show streaks of grey, then silver, then white. The smooth skin of her face developed fine lines, then deeper wrinkles, then age spots. Her posture became more stooped, her voice became more frail, and her movements became slower and more deliberate. What terrified Sarah most was that neither Marie nor Jean-Baptiste seemed aware that anything unusual was happening. They continued their conversation about their financial problems, as if aging backwards and forwards was perfectly normal. Sarah tried to maintain her professional composure, but she found herself struggling to focus on the domestic dispute that had brought her to the house. She kept glancing at her watch, trying to anchor herself in normal time, but even her watch seemed to be behaving strangely. The second hand was moving, but it appeared to be moving backwards, and the digital display was showing times that made no sense. When she had entered the house, it had been 11:52 p.m., but now her watch read 11:47 p.m., as if time itself was moving in reverse. The domestic dispute, which had supposedly involved shouting and broken dishes, seemed to be resolving itself in the most bizarre way possible. As Marie aged and Jean-Baptiste grew younger, their argument began to reverse. They stopped fighting and started apologizing to each other. Broken dishes on the floor began to reassemble themselves, pieces of ceramic flying through the air and fusing back together as if the destruction was being played backwards. Furniture that had been overturned righted itself, and the chaos of the domestic disturbance literally rewound itself into domestic harmony. Sarah realized she needed to leave the house immediately. Whatever was happening here was beyond her ability to understand or control, and she was beginning to fear for her own safety. But when she tried to move toward the front door, she discovered that her sense of direction had become completely unreliable. The rooms she had walked through to reach the living room no longer led back to the entrance. Hallways that should have been straight contained curves and corners that hadn't been there before. Staircases led to floors that couldn't exist in a 3-story building. The house had become a maze that defied its own architecture. As Sarah wandered through rooms that shouldn't exist, trying to find her way back to the street, she began to encounter other members of the Thibodeau family. There was a teenage girl named Celeste, who was rapidly aging into middle age, and an elderly man named Auguste, who was becoming younger with each passing moment. There were children who were growing into adults, and adults who were shrinking into children. The entire family seemed to be caught in temporal currents that flowed in different directions, aging at different rates, experiencing time as a fluid, inconsistent force, rather than the steady, reliable progression that Sarah had always taken for granted. The most disturbing encounter came when Sarah met a woman who introduced herself as Marie Thibodeau, but this Marie appeared to be in her 80s, with white hair and deeply wrinkled skin. This elderly Marie claimed to be the same woman Sarah had met at the front door, but she also claimed to remember Sarah's visit as something that had happened decades in the past. According to this older Marie, Sarah had been coming to the house for years, responding to the same domestic disturbance call over and over again, but each time she arrived, the family was at a different stage in their backwards aging process. Sarah tried to radio for backup, but her radio produced only static, and when she attempted to use her cell phone, she discovered that it was showing no signal and no network connectivity. More frightening, the time display on her phone was changing rapidly, jumping forward and backward through different hours, days, and even months. She watched in horror as the date shifted from October 2019 to March 2003 to July 2024 to September 1987, as if her phone was receiving signals from multiple timelines simultaneously. The house itself seemed to be responding to the temporal chaos affecting its inhabitants. Wallpaper patterns changed from Victorian florals to modern geometrics to colonial prints as Sarah watched. Furniture morphed from antique pieces to contemporary designs to styles that seemed to be from decades in the future. Light fixtures shifted from electric bulbs to gas flames to LED arrays that cast colors Sarah had never seen before. The house was aging and unaging, renovating and deteriorating, existing in multiple time periods simultaneously. After what felt like hours of wandering through impossible rooms and meeting family members who were living their lives in reverse, Sarah finally found what appeared to be the front door. But when she opened it, instead of stepping onto Dauphine Street, she found herself in the backyard of the house, facing a garden that was experiencing seasonal changes at an accelerated pace. Flowers bloomed and died in minutes. Trees grew leaves and lost them in rapid cycles, and the grass grew tall and then mowed itself in endless repetition. Sarah ran toward what she hoped was the front of the house, but each corner she turned led to another impossible vista. She saw versions of New Orleans from different time periods, horse-drawn carriages sharing streets with modern cars, gas lamps coexisting with electric streetlights, buildings that had been demolished decades ago, standing next to structures that hadn't been built yet. The French Quarter was existing in multiple timelines simultaneously, and Sarah was trapped in the temporal intersection. Finally, after an eternity of running through a city that was constantly changing around her, Sarah found herself back on Dauphine Street, standing next to her patrol car. But when she checked her watch and her phone, she discovered that she had been inside the house for 72 hours. 3 complete days had passed while she experienced what felt like 20 minutes of confusion and terror. Her radio was crackling with calls from dispatch, asking for her location and status. Her sergeant was demanding an explanation for her disappearance. Missing person reports had been filed, and search teams had been looking for her throughout the quarter. But the most chilling discovery came when Sarah looked back at 1247 Dauphine Street. The house was completely dark, with boards nailed over the windows and a condemned sign posted on the front doors. When she radioed for information about the property, dispatch informed her that the house had been vacant for 15 years, ever since the last residents, an elderly couple named Marie and Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, had died in a murder-suicide that was never fully explained. Sarah Delacroix never returned to patrol duty in the French Quarter. She transferred to a different district, then to a different city, then eventually left law enforcement entirely. But she still has nightmares about the backwards house, about time flowing in the wrong direction, about a family trapped in temporal loops that forced them to live their lives in reverse. And sometimes, when she's driving through unfamiliar neighborhoods, she'll see a house that looks normal from the outside, but something about the way the light hits the windows or the way the shadows fall across the front door will make her wonder if she's about to step into another place where time has forgotten how to move forward, where reality bends backwards on itself, and where 72 hours can pass in the space of 20 minutes, leaving only confusion, terror, and the absolute certainty that some doors should never be opened. Let's move to our third story, and what Sergeant Tommy Nakamura experienced on the night of November the 7th, 2020, will make you question the very nature of existence itself. Tommy had been with Portland PD for 15 years, the last 3 as a night shift supervisor at the North Precinct on Killingsworth Street. He was the kind of officer who took pride in running a tight ship, meticulous with paperwork, punctual with schedules, and absolutely devoted to ensuring that his officers got home safely at the end of every shift. His colleagues respected him for his steady leadership during the civil unrest that had plagued Portland throughout 2020, and his superiors valued his ability to maintain order and morale even during the department's most challenging period in decades. The North Precinct housed approximately 40 officers across 3 shifts, with the night shift typically staffed by 12 patrol officers, 3 detectives, 2 desk sergeants, and various support personnel. Tommy knew every officer under his command personally, had attended their weddings and children's birthday parties, had counseled them through divorces and family crises, and had written commendations and performance reviews that helped shape their careers. The precinct building itself was a fortress-like structure built in the 1960s, with thick concrete walls, narrow windows, and multiple security checkpoints designed to withstand riots and armed attacks. It was a place where Tommy felt completely at home, where every hallway, every office, every piece of equipment was as familiar to him as the layout of his own house. On the evening of November the 7th, Tommy arrived at the precinct at 10:45 p.m. for his usual 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. The autumn rain was falling steadily, creating the kind of misty grey atmosphere that Portland residents knew would persist for the next 6 months. Tommy parked in his designated spot in the staff lot, used his keycard to access the building through the rear entrance, and walked through the corridors toward the main desk area where he would receive the evening briefing from the day shift supervisor and review the incident reports that had accumulated during the afternoon. But when Tommy entered the main floor of the precinct, he found it completely, utterly empty. Not just quiet, which would have been unusual but explainable, but entirely devoid of human presence. The overhead fluorescent lights were on, the computers were running, the radio dispatch system was crackling with routine traffic, but there were no officers, no desk personnel, no janitors, no security guards. The coffee pot in the break room was freshly brewed and still warm, suggesting that people had been there recently, but Tommy could find no one anywhere in the building. Tommy's first assumption was that there had been a major incident requiring all available personnel, though he couldn't understand why he hadn't been notified. He checked his phone for missed calls or text messages, but found nothing. He tried calling his lieutenant, but the call went directly to voicemail. He attempted to radio dispatch, but received only static in response. The digital displays throughout the precinct showed normal operations. Patrol units were logged as active, officers were listed as on duty, and the computer system indicated that the building was fully staffed. But Tommy was completely, inexplicably alone. He began a systematic search of the building, starting with the patrol briefing room where the night shift should have been receiving their assignments. The room was set up for a meeting, chairs arranged in rows, a presentation prepared on the digital whiteboard, coffee cups and notepads positioned as if officers had just stepped out momentarily. But the coffee was still hot. The presentation was mid-sentence, and the notepads contained partial notes that looked like they had been abandoned in the middle of being written. It was as if an entire room full of people had simply vanished mid-conversation. Tommy moved through the detective bureau, the evidence room, the holding cells, the administrative offices, and the communications center, finding the same pattern everywhere. Spaces that had clearly been occupied moments earlier, but were now completely empty. Computer screens displayed active case files. Desk lamps were turned on over half-completed reports, and personal items like family photographs and coffee mugs suggested that officers had expected to return to their workstations. In the locker room, some lockers were standing open with uniforms hanging inside, and wet towels on the benches indicated that officers had recently showered after their shifts. The most unsettling discovery came when Tommy accessed the building's security system. The electronic logs showed that all night shift personnel had badged into the building at their normal times between 10:30 and 11:00 p.m. According to the computer records, every officer was present and accounted for. None had badged out, and the building's security status showed normal operations with full staffing. But Tommy was the only person in the entire structure walking through a precinct that was simultaneously occupied and abandoned. Tommy tried calling other Portland precincts to report the situation, but found that his calls were being routed to automated systems that seemed to loop endlessly without connecting him to actual personnel. When he tried calling 911 from his cell phone, he received a busy signal, something that should have been impossible given the redundant systems designed to ensure that emergency calls always get through. Even more disturbing, when he tried calling his wife to let her know he was dealing with an unusual situation at work, he discovered that her phone number had been disconnected, though he had spoken to her just 3 hours earlier before leaving for his shift. As the night progressed, Tommy continued his duties as if the precinct was normally staffed. He reviewed incident reports, monitored radio traffic, and maintained the logs that documented the night's activities. But the radio traffic he was hearing didn't match what he was observing. Dispatch was communicating with patrol units, giving assignments and receiving status updates. But Tommy could see through the precinct's windows that none of the patrol cars in the lot had moved, and none of the officers who were supposedly responding to calls were visible anywhere in the building. The psychological impact of the isolation began to manifest around 2:00 a.m. Tommy found himself talking aloud, addressing empty desks as if they were occupied, responding to conversations that weren't happening, and maintaining the social interactions that would normally fill his supervisory duties. He caught himself saying good morning to empty doorways, nodding in agreement with points that no one had made, and laughing at jokes that no one had told. The human need for social connection was so strong that Tommy's mind was creating interactions even when no other people were present. Around 3:30 a.m., Tommy decided to review the precinct's security footage to determine when and how his officers had left the building. But when he accessed the surveillance system, he made a discovery that challenged his understanding of reality itself. The security cameras showed Tommy moving through the precinct alone, just as he expected, but they also showed him having conversations with invisible people, sitting in meetings with empty chairs, and responding to briefings that no one was giving. The footage revealed that Tommy had been alone in the building since he arrived, but he had been behaving as if he was surrounded by his normal complement of officers and staff. More disturbing still, when Tommy reviewed footage from previous nights, he saw the same pattern extending back weeks. The security cameras showed him arriving each night to an empty building, conducting briefings with no one in attendance, having conversations with colleagues who weren't there, and performing supervisory duties over officers who didn't exist. According to the surveillance footage, Tommy had been working alone in the precinct for at least a month, but he had clear, detailed memories of interacting with his officers, reviewing their reports, and managing their caseloads. The most chilling revelation came when Tommy accessed personnel records and discovered that most of the officers he remembered supervising had been transferred, retired, or terminated months earlier. Officer Jennifer Walsh, whom Tommy remembered briefing just the previous night about a domestic violence case, had actually retired in August. Detective Mike Rodriguez, who Tommy recalled discussing a burglary investigation with last week, had been transferred to the East Precinct in September. Sergeant Lisa Chen, who Tommy was certain had worked the previous weekend, had actually taken early retirement due to a line-of-duty injury that occurred in July. As Tommy delved deeper into the personnel records, he realized that the North Precinct's night shift had been gradually reduced due to budget cuts and staffing shortages throughout 2020. What had once been a fully staffed operation with 12 patrol officers had been whittled down to just 3 officers, then 2, then 1, and finally to Tommy, working alone as both supervisor and patrol officer. But somehow, Tommy's mind had continued to perceive the precinct as fully staffed, creating detailed interactions with officers who were no longer there, maintaining the social and professional relationships that had defined his career for 15 years. The psychological defense mechanism that had allowed Tommy to function despite the profound isolation began to break down as he confronted the reality of his situation. He realized that he had been talking to himself for weeks, creating elaborate scenarios and conversations to fill the void left by his absent colleagues. The coffee that was always fresh had been brewed by Tommy himself, though he had no memory of making it. The reports that appeared to be written by other officers were actually his own work, though the handwriting looked different because he had been unconsciously varying his penmanship to create the illusion of multiple authors. The most terrifying discovery came when Tommy found his own personnel file and read the psychological evaluation that had been conducted after his wife's death in a car accident 3 months earlier. The evaluation noted that Tommy was experiencing difficulty accepting loss, was showing signs of dissociation, and was demonstrating an unhealthy attachment to his work routine as a way of avoiding grief. The department psychologist had recommended counseling and a temporary reduction in responsibilities, but Tommy had no memory of the evaluation, the accident, or his wife's death. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, Tommy realized that he had been living in a carefully constructed psychological bubble, one that allowed him to continue functioning in his role as night shift supervisor, even as his world collapsed around him. His wife was dead, his officers had been reassigned, and his precinct had been effectively closed except for his lone presence. But his mind had created an alternate reality where everything remained as it had been before his personal tragedy. The sun was beginning to rise over Portland as Tommy sat at his desk, surrounded by the evidence of his isolation and self-deception. The morning shift would arrive soon, though Tommy now understood that morning shift consisted of a single-day supervisor who worked out of a different building and had no regular interaction with the North Precinct. Tommy would file his reports, lock up the building, and drive home to an empty house where he would sleep alone and dream of a life that had ended 3 months ago, but continued to exist in his fractured perception of reality. Tommy Nakamura took medical leave the following week and never returned to active duty. He underwent extensive psychological treatment for complicated grief and dissociative disorder, slowly learning to distinguish between his memories of how things used to be and his hallucinations of how things continued to be. But even now, years later, Tommy sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that he needs to get to work, that his officers are waiting for him, that the North Precinct is fully staffed and operating normally. He has to remind himself each time that the people he supervised, the wife he loved, and the career he valued all exist now only in his memory, and that sometimes the mind creates elaborate illusions to protect us from truths too painful to accept, even when those illusions trap us in empty buildings where we talk to ghosts and supervise officers who will never again answer their radios or come home safely at the end of their shifts. Let's move to our fourth story, and what Officer Dakota Rivera experienced on Interstate 10 in the Arizona desert will make you question the nature of identity itself and whether the people in your life are truly who they claim to be. Dakota had been patrolling the highways around Phoenix for 8 years, specializing in high-speed pursuits and traffic enforcement in some of the most dangerous stretches of desert highway in the American Southwest. She was known throughout the department for her exceptional driving skills, her ability to remain calm during high-stress situations, and her uncanny instinct for reading people and situations before they escalated into violence. These qualities made what happened to her on the night of August 23, 2018, all the more disturbing, because Dakota Rivera was not someone who imagined things, who panicked under pressure, or who let her perception be clouded by fear or confusion. The call came in at 11:27 p.m. as a high-priority pursuit of a stolen vehicle heading westbound on I-10 near the Estrella Mountains. The suspects had allegedly robbed a convenience store in Tempe, shot the clerk during the robbery, and were now fleeing toward California in a dark green Ford Explorer with Nevada license plates. Dakota was positioned at mile marker 112, about 40 miles west of Phoenix, when she received the alert to intercept and join the pursuit that was already involving 3 other patrol units. The desert highway at night was Dakota's element. Long straightaways where her Crown Victoria could reach its top speed, minimal traffic to complicate the chase, and enough open space that suspects rarely had anywhere to run once their vehicles were disabled. As Dakota accelerated to join the pursuit, she could see the headlights of the stolen Explorer about 2 miles ahead, weaving between the sparse late-night traffic at speeds approaching NINS, 80 miles per hour. The radio chatter indicated that the suspects were armed and had already fired shots at pursuing officers, making this an extremely high-risk situation that required careful coordination and tactical precision. Dakota's role was to position herself as a blocking unit, using a technique called a precision immobilization technique to stop the vehicle without endangering civilians or causing a high-speed collision that might kill everyone involved. The pursuit continued for approximately 15 minutes, with the stolen Explorer maintaining dangerous speeds, while Dakota and her fellow officers coordinated their approach using radio communication and advanced tactical training. The desert landscape flashed past in a blur of sagebrush, rocky outcroppings, and the occasional cluster of lights from isolated gas stations or truck stops. Dakota could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-speed pursuits, but she also maintained the professional focus that had made her one of the department's most reliable officers in dangerous situations. At mile marker 97, near the tiny desert town of Buckeye, the stolen Explorer suddenly veered off the highway and crashed through a chain-link fence into the desert scrubland. The vehicle rolled 3 times before coming to rest upside down against a large boulder about 200 yards from the interstate. Dakota was the first officer to reach the crash site, followed closely by Officers Martinez and Thompson from the other pursuing units. The 3 officers approached the overturned vehicle with their weapons drawn, expecting to find 2 armed suspects who would likely be injured, but still potentially dangerous. What Dakota found when she looked inside the overturned Explorer was 2 male suspects, both appearing to be in their early 20s, both unconscious but breathing, both matching the descriptions that had been provided by the convenience store witnesses. One suspect was pinned under the steering wheel with obvious injuries to his head and chest, while the other was hanging upside down from his seatbelt with blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. But as Dakota began to coordinate the medical response and secure the scene, she noticed something that made her pause and look more carefully at the wreckage. There was a third person in the vehicle. Sitting in the back seat, completely uninjured and seemingly unaffected by the violent rollover crash, was a man who appeared to be in his 30s with dark hair, wearing a denim jacket and jeans. He was sitting upright despite the fact that the vehicle was inverted, and he was looking directly at Dakota with an expression of calm recognition, as if he had been expecting her to find him there. The man made no attempt to flee, showed no signs of distress about the accident, and seemed completely out of place among the chaos of the crash scene. Dakota immediately called out to Officers Martinez and Thompson, alerting them to the third suspect. But when they approached the vehicle and looked where Dakota was pointing, they saw only the 2 original suspects. Martinez shined his flashlight directly into the back seat area where Dakota was staring. But according to him, the space was empty except for scattered debris from the crash. Thompson walked around to the other side of the vehicle to get a different angle, but he also reported seeing nothing unusual in the back seat. But Dakota could see the third man clearly, and more disturbing still, he was now speaking to her in a voice that only she seemed able to hear. The man introduced himself as Dakota Rivera, claiming to be her from what he described as a parallel timeline where she had made different choices, taken different risks, and lived a different life. According to this other Dakota, he had been tracking her for months, appearing at the scenes of her most dangerous calls, watching her make decisions that he had made differently in his own reality. The man who claimed to be another version of Dakota began to describe intimate details about her life that no stranger could possibly know. He mentioned her childhood fear of drowning after nearly drowning in a swimming pool at age 7, a fear she had never discussed with anyone, not even her closest friends or family members. He described the scar on her left knee from a bicycle accident when she was 12, a barely visible mark that was hidden under her uniform pants and unknown to her colleagues. He recounted conversations she had had with her mother about her decision to become a police officer, private discussions that had taken place in her childhood home with no witnesses present. Most unsettling of all, the other Dakota began to describe cases she had worked, but with different outcomes than what she remembered. He told her about a domestic violence call where she had arrived too late to save the victim, though Dakota remembered successfully de-escalating that same situation. He described a traffic stop that had turned into a shootout where she had been wounded, though Dakota had no memory of ever being injured in the line of duty. He spoke about a partner named James who had been killed during a drug raid, though Dakota had never worked with anyone by that name and had never been involved in a raid that resulted in an officer fatality. As the other Dakota continued talking, Officers Martinez and Thompson were becoming increasingly concerned about Dakota's behavior. From their perspective, she was having an intense, one-sided conversation with an empty back seat, responding to statements that no one else could hear, and asking questions that seemed to be directed at invisible participants. They began to worry that she had suffered a head injury during the pursuit, or that she was experiencing some kind of psychological break brought on by the stress of the high-speed chase. The man, claiming to be another version of Dakota, began to explain the nature of what he called dimensional bleeding, a phenomenon where parallel realities occasionally intersected, allowing people to glimpse alternate versions of their own lives. According to his explanation, every major decision creates a branching point where reality splits into multiple timelines, and sometimes those timelines cross paths in ways that allow communication between different versions of the same person. He claimed that Dakota's job as a police officer, which constantly placed her in high-stress life-or-death situations, made her particularly susceptible to these interdimensional encounters. The other Dakota then began to show her visions of the life she might have lived if she had made different choices. She saw herself as a detective working homicide cases in a major city, investigating murders that were far more complex and disturbing than the highway patrol work she did in Arizona. She saw herself married to a man she had never met, living in a house she had never seen, raising children who looked like her, but existed in a reality where she had chosen family over career. She saw herself dead in a car accident that had occurred 3 years earlier, killed by a drunk driver during a routine traffic stop that had gone wrong in ways that defied probability and logic. Each vision was accompanied by detailed sensory information that made the alternate realities feel completely authentic. Dakota could smell the coffee in the detective bureau where her other self worked, could feel the weight of a different weapon on her hip, could hear the voices of children calling her mom in a timeline where she had chosen to have a family. The visions were so vivid and emotionally compelling that Dakota began to question which reality was actually real, which version of her life was the authentic one, and whether the choices she had made were truly her own or were being influenced by knowledge of other possibilities. The medical response team arrived to treat the 2 injured suspects, but they also reported that they could see only 2 people in the vehicle. The paramedics worked to extract the unconscious men from the wreckage, while Dakota continued her conversation with the 3rd passenger that only she could perceive. The other Dakota warned her about future dangers she would face, described cases she would work that would test her abilities and her sanity, and offered advice about decisions she would need to make that would determine which timeline she would ultimately inhabit. As the suspects were loaded into ambulances and the crash scene was being processed by the accident investigation team, the other Dakota began to fade, becoming less substantial and more difficult to see clearly. Before disappearing entirely, he told Dakota that she would encounter him again at moments of critical decision-making, that he would continue to appear when she was faced with choices that could fundamentally alter the course of her life. He warned her that not all versions of herself were benevolent, that some alternate Dakotas had made darker choices and become dangerous, and that she would need to learn to distinguish between helpful guidance and malicious manipulation. The crash investigation revealed that the stolen Explorer had contained only 2 suspects, both of whom were hospitalized with serious injuries and later charged with armed robbery and attempted murder. The convenience store clerk survived his gunshot wound and was able to identify both suspects in a lineup. There was no evidence that a third person had been in the vehicle, no forensic trace of another passenger, and no witness testimony from anyone other than Dakota about additional suspects. But Dakota's experience that night changed her fundamentally. She began to notice moments of déjà vu that felt less like memory and more like glimpses of alternate timelines. She would respond to calls and have the distinct impression that she had worked the same case before, but with different outcomes. She would meet people who seemed familiar, though she was certain she had never encountered them, and they would sometimes reference conversations or shared experiences that existed only in realities she had never lived. Most disturbing of all, Dakota began to see other versions of her colleagues, alternate versions of officers Martinez and Thompson, who would appear at crime scenes and provide information about cases that hadn't happened yet or had happened differently in other timelines. She learned to keep these encounters to herself, understanding that discussing interdimensional experiences with her supervisors would likely result in psychological evaluation and possible termination. Dakota Rivera still works for Phoenix PD, but she has developed an almost supernatural ability to predict how situations will unfold, to anticipate the behavior of suspects and victims, and to make tactical decisions that seem to be based on knowledge she shouldn't possess. Her colleagues consider her one of the most intuitive officers in the department, but they don't know that her instincts are actually memories from alternate versions of herself who have lived through similar situations with different outcomes. She has learned to navigate the intersections between multiple realities, to distinguish between the timeline she inhabits and the timeline she visits, and to make choices based not just on the immediate consequences she can see, but on the long-term effects she can glimpse across multiple versions of her life. But Dakota also knows that each encounter with alternate versions of herself brings her closer to a fundamental choice about which reality she wants to claim as her own, and whether the person she believes herself to be is actually the authentic Dakota Rivera, or just another passenger in someone else's journey through the infinite possibilities of existence. Let's move to our 5th story, one that begins in a concrete basement under flickering fluorescent tubes and ends somewhere far outside the coordinates of ordinary space-time. Detective Priya Sharma had logged 11 years with Seattle PD's Major Crimes Unit, most of them spent cataloging nightmares, serial arsons in Rainier Valley, a mass poisoning at a South Lake Union Tech campus, a string of disappearances tied to container ships docking at Pier 86. Colleagues joked that Priya took comfort in chaos because she could always reduce it to labeled bags and numbered photos. That reputation is why, on the wet November evening of 2022, her lieutenant assigned her a mind-numbing but supposedly simple task: modernize the cavernous downtown evidence vault before the city's new digital tracking system went live. The vault lurked beneath the 1909 courthouse, its original walls charred from a century-old boiler fire and never fully refinished. It held every manner of object the city's criminals had left behind: revolvers rusted immobile, crackling Polaroids pulled from motel trash cans, even a jangling box of antique keys no desk sergeant could match to any door. Detectives hated the place. Priya, however, felt oddly serene, surrounded by tangible proof that bad things could be boxed, locked, and eventually forgotten. She descended the steel staircase at 1803, iPad in hand, determined to barcode every shelf row by row. The building's boilers groaned like distant surf. Overhead pipes wept condensation that pattered on the concrete. She told herself she would finish a full aisle before grabbing curry at the late-night spot on 5th. That goal evaporated almost immediately. Row A12 should have contained rape kit samples from 1997, sealed in climate-controlled crates. Instead, she found a wooden cigar box she'd never seen, untagged, resting precisely where the crate's number should have been stenciled. The box smelled of cedar and darkroom chemicals. When she cracked it open, she discovered 8 color photographs, vivid, impossibly crisp, of a crime scene dated January 14, 2023. The problem: that date lay 2 months in the future. The photos showed a graffiti-blasted alley off Occidental Square. A young man sprawled face down, a white chestnut clutched in his left hand, arterial blood tracing fractal patterns across wet cobblestones. Priya glanced at the metadata her new scanner automatically extracted from each image. The timestamps matched the future date down to millisecond precision. She flipped the last photo over. Scrawled in thick Sharpie were GPS coordinates and a sticky note bearing her own signature, unmistakably hers, advising bag evidence before it starts moving. For the first time in a decade of crime scenes, Priya felt her pulse hammer her ribs. She shoved the box back, convinced some sick prankster was at work. Yet policy required she log anomalies, so she created an entry. Item appears out of chain of custody scope. Investigate provenance. She locked the box in an empty firearm locker and pressed on. Row B3 delivered stranger cargo. Instead of the expected narcotics seized in 2018, she found a sealed evidence envelope marked S237142. That number belonged to no case in the city's database. She checked twice. Inside lay a single latex glove, fingers splayed stiff. Yet the glove was moving, twitching as though invisible tendons still flexed within. Its fingertips tapped the envelope wall in a slow, syncopated rhythm. She resealed the package, recorded everything, but the moment she set it aside, her barcode reader updated automatically. The item now showed transfer date March 5, 2024, again months ahead. By 2300, Priya had catalogued more anachronisms than legitimate evidence. A blood-spattered page torn from a diary titled Entry for 29th May 2025. A thumb drive full of encrypted video files time-stamped 3 years forward. A revolver tagged as belonging to a suspect Priya had arrested that very morning. Somehow already tested, ballistics matched, case closed. Each item predicted future crimes, or future iterations of current cases, with unnerving specificity. Every package also included a blue index card, stamped with the same 3 words: keep the loop. Shaking, Priya returned to row A12 to retrieve the cigar box. The locker was sealed, numeric keypad unchanged, yet the box was gone. In its place sat a manila folder labeled Sharma P. She ripped it open. Inside were photocopies of her own incident reports, ones she had not written yet, detailing tonight's discoveries down to her verbatim reactions. The final page bore a single-line addendum in red ink, and this is where she starts believing. Just then, the overhead lights cut out. For 4 seconds, the basement plunged into black so complete that Priya lost orientation. When power fluttered back, the aisles had rearranged themselves. The metal shelving now formed a spiral corridor corkscrewing deeper into what should have been foundation wall. The air smelled of ozone and old dust. Her phone read 000101 1900. The staircase she'd used hours earlier no longer existed. Priya's rational mind splintered into survival protocols: catalog environment, mark path, locate egress. She broke a chalk evidence marker in half, using it to draw arrows on shelving end caps as she followed the corridor's inward turn. But as she proceeded, the arrows altered themselves, shifting direction, morphing into unfamiliar symbols, then erasing entirely. It was as though the building refused to record any linear trail. Mid-spiral, she tumbled upon a workstation, a battered metal desk, a humming desktop PC, and a glowing CRT monitor displaying a command prompt awaiting input. The keyboard's spacebar pulsed with faint blue light. On instinct, she typed her badge number. Lines of text cascaded. "Welcome, Detective Priya Sharma. Chain of custody correction protocol engaged. Event count 4102. Next anomaly arrives in 00000327. A digital clock began to tick down. Before she could interrogate the system further, a clatter echoed behind her. Cardboard sliding against metal. She spun to see a sealed evidence box materializing on an empty shelf, molecular cohesion assembling under invisible hands. When the countdown hit 0, it snapped into full solidity, barcode already printed. She scanned it, hands trembling, and the data popped up. Missing child case. Date of discovery, 11/12/2027. Collector, D.P. Sharma. She pried the box open. Inside lay a glow-in-the-dark plastic dinosaur smeared with ash, a child's sneaker half melted by heat, and a Polaroid of a blazing suburban home. In the corner of the photo, her own silhouette appeared, fire reflecting in her eyes. She'd never worked a child abduction arson, but the mother's pleading face, visible behind caution tape, was someone Priya recognized from her morning commute, a woman who sold coffee outside Pioneer Square. The evidence room wasn't just forecasting crimes, it was scripting her future investigations. Panic threatened to swamp her, yet training held. Every investigation, she reminded herself, has a pattern. Find the pattern. You find the perpetrator. She searched the surrounding shelves and discovered a clipboard listing cycle sequences, with dates looping between 1909 and 2035. Each sequence noted, collect, file, forget, recollect. The handwriting? Her own, though aged, ink feathered, pressure heavier, as if written after decades of repetition. It dawned then. The evidence room was a temporal repository, a place that existed outside linear time. Detectives didn't just store objects here. The room stored possibilities, continually seeding them back into earlier moments to ensure their own future discovery. Keep the loop was instruction and warning. Break the loop, and the chain of custody of reality itself might fracture. Priya tested a hypothesis. She selected an unsolved murder file from 2016 that had always haunted her. The Ravenna Park Strangler. 3 victims, no solid leads. She removed the victim's scarf, stepped to an untagged shelf, and placed it there without labeling. Instantaneously, the barcode printer spit out a new label dated April 6, 2024, noting, DNA match confirmed, suspect apprehended. A sticky note fluttered free. You're welcome. Past you. She realized an awful reciprocity governed the vault. By offering evidence into the spiral, she could gain solutions from her own future work. But each gift demanded another anomaly deeper in time, a quid pro quo across decades. Every shortcut for justice entangled her further in a web of predestination. The workstation chimed again. New visitor. Footsteps echoed. A heavy tread descending phantom stairs. Priya crouched behind shelving, weapon drawn, though some instinct warned bullets were meaningless here. A figure emerged. An older woman with silver-streaked hair in a Seattle PD trench coat. She moved, with Priya's posture, her gait. Their eyes locked. Priya saw herself 20 years hence. First loop's the hardest, future Priya said softly. I came to make sure you don't do anything rash. Present. Priya's voice cracked. Am I trapped? We volunteered, the elder version replied. The room keeps reality coherent by recycling it. We're its custodians. Every detective who masters it becomes both archivist and architect. She extended a trembling hand, offering Priya a slim ledger labeled Rules of Engagement. Before Priya could accept, the overhead pipes groaned violently and a siren wailed, the building's ancient fire alarm. The elder Priya hissed, Timeline breach. Something you removed wasn't yours to give. Shelves shuddered. Boxes toppled. Tags rewrote themselves in frantic loops of digits. The latex glove package burst, the gloves skittering across concrete like a white spider before evaporating into dust. The building's foundation throbbed with seismic pulses. Over the din, future Priya shouted, Restore what you took or collapse begins! Priya sprinted back toward the scarf's shelf, but the corridor reshaped, shelving pivoting like clock gears, blocking the path. With each wrong turn, the concrete ceiling lowered an inch, squeezing space into crushing claustrophobia. She remembered the chalk mark's betrayal and shut her eyes, picturing the vault's earlier layout, her eidetic memory reconstructing row lengths, vent positions, moisture stains. She envisioned the route not as a hallway but as flowchart logic. If data removed, then reorder to nearest common year. Her next step aligned with that mental map, and the shelves parted. She slammed the Ravenna scarf back into its original evidence crate. Instantly the alarms ceased. Ceiling lifted. Fluorescent lights glowed steady. The barcode reverted to its 2016 tag. Justice delayed. Loop preserved. Breathing ragged, she searched for her elder self, but the woman had vanished, leaving only the ledger. Priya opened it. First rule, trust the chain. Second, no item enters before its witness is ready. Third, underlined twice. Every solved case births an unsolved one. Balance is survival. Suddenly, the basement staircase rematerialized at corridor's end. Her phone flickered to life. Time, 07:14, only minutes past her scheduled shift end. She ascended, clutching the ledger. Dawn rain glittered on courthouse steps. City noises resumed normal pitch. In the squad room above, officers bustled exactly as they had yesterday, except an APB now sat atop the morning brief. Homicide in an Occidental Square alley. Male victim. Chess piece found at scene. Priya's stomach turned electric. The future was arriving on schedule. She requested lead on the case, filed her preliminary report, and sealed the ledger inside her desk drawer. She understood now that her job had expanded beyond detective work. She would become steward of an evidence room that functioned as the police department's subconscious, dreaming crimes, remembering futures, forgetting pasts, until they became present again. Each night she would descend, honoring the loop, bending probability just enough to serve justice without snapping causality's spine. Some nights, though, she lies awake listening to Seattle rain hammer her apartment windows, wondering what price she'll pay years from now when she returns as the silver-haired guardian who tried to guide her. She wonders how many versions of herself have already walked that spiral, how many more will follow. And she fears the ledger's unwritten final rule, the one she can sense between the lines. Eventually, the evidence room shelves everything, even us. Let's move to our sixth story, and what Officer Ezra Baptiste experienced in the neon-drenched streets of Miami will make you question whether free will exists, or if we're all trapped in cycles we cannot escape. Ezra had been patrolling the Overtown district for 6 years, working the midnight shift in one of Miami's most challenging neighborhoods, where domestic violence calls were as regular as the Atlantic tides. He was known for his patience, his ability to de-escalate volatile situations, and his genuine concern for the families caught in cycles of abuse and poverty. These qualities made what happened to him on the humid night of July 4, 2019, all the more disturbing, because Ezra Baptiste was not someone who gave up on people, who walked away from problems, or who let victims suffer when he had the power to help. The address was 1247 Northwest 3rd Avenue, a crumbling two-story duplex painted the color of faded flamingos, sandwiched between a botanica selling religious candles and a corner store with bulletproof glass. Ezra had been to this address 17 times in the past year, always for domestic disturbance calls involving Carlos and Maria Vega, a couple in their 30s who seemed trapped in an escalating pattern of alcohol-fueled arguments that neighbors could hear 3 blocks away. The calls always followed the same pattern. Maria would scream for help. Carlos would shout threats and throw furniture. Someone would call 911, and by the time Ezra arrived, the situation would have cooled to sullen silence and mutual accusations that led nowhere because neither party would press charges. On this particular night, the call came in at 2:17 a.m. with the familiar refrain, "Domestic disturbance, 1247 Northwest 3rd Avenue. Female caller reports male subject threatening violence. Sounds of breaking glass. Request immediate response." Ezra sighed as he acknowledged it. Get the call, knowing exactly what he would find when he arrived. The July heat was oppressive even at this late hour, the air thick with humidity that made his uniform stick to his skin and turned every breath into an effort. Fireworks from 4th of July celebrations still popped sporadically in the distance, mixing celebration with the sound of sirens and the low thrum of reggaeton music drifting from open windows. As Ezra parked his patrol car in front of the duplex, he could see the familiar pattern already playing out. The front door was standing open, spilling harsh fluorescent light onto the cracked sidewalk. Maria Vega stood on the front steps in a thin nightgown, her arms wrapped around herself, her face showing the telltale signs of recent tears. Carlos was visible through the doorway, pacing back and forth in the living room, gesturing wildly and shouting in rapid Spanish that echoed off the concrete walls of the narrow courtyard. Broken glass from what appeared to be a beer bottle glittered on the walkway, and the smell of alcohol and stale cigarettes hung in the humid air like a toxic cloud. Ezra approached the scene with practiced caution, his hand resting near his radio in case backup was needed, though he had handled this exact situation so many times that he could predict every word that would be spoken in the next 20 minutes. Maria would claim that Carlos had been drinking since noon, that he had accused her of cheating with their neighbor, that he had grabbed her arm and thrown a bottle at the wall near her head. Carlos would deny everything, claim that Maria was exaggerating, insist that he had only been defending himself against her verbal attacks. Both would refuse to press charges. Ezra would file a report that would disappear into the bureaucratic void, and within a week, he would be back at the same address, responding to the same call. But as Ezra began his approach to the front steps, something felt different. The air seemed thicker than usual, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching thunderstorm. He could see building over Biscayne Bay. The streetlights appeared to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, and the distant sound of fireworks had taken on a hollow, echoing quality that made them sound like they were coming from much farther away than they should have been. Most unsettling of all, Maria Vega looked directly at him as he approached and said, "Officer Baptiste, you're back again. How many times are we going to do this?" The question stopped Ezra in his tracks, because Maria had never acknowledged the repetitive nature of their encounters before. In all his previous visits, she had always acted as if each incident was isolated, as if she didn't remember him from the dozens of previous responses to the same address. But now she was looking at him with a mixture of resignation and recognition that suggested she was aware of the cycle they were all trapped in. More disturbing still, when Ezra looked more carefully at the scene, he realized that everything was exactly as it had been on his previous visit 3 days earlier. The same broken beer bottle, the same tear tracks on Maria's cheeks, the same angry gestures from Carlos visible through the doorway. Ezra followed his usual protocol, separating the couple to get individual statements. But as he began his interview with Maria, she started providing answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. When he opened his mouth to ask about the cause of the argument, Maria immediately said, "Carlos thinks I'm sleeping with Miguel from next door. He's been drinking since noon and threw a Corona bottle at the wall near my head at exactly 2:09 a.m. When Ezra prepared to ask if she wanted to press charges, Maria shook her head and said, "I won't sign a complaint because I still love him, and I'm afraid he'll get deported if he gets arrested." Every response was identical to what she had told him during his previous visit, delivered in the same tone of voice, with the same pauses and inflections. It was as if Maria was reciting lines from a script she had memorized, playing her role in a drama that had been performed so many times that all spontaneity had been drained from it. Even more unsettling, when Ezra walked into the duplex to speak with Carlos, he found the man standing in exactly the same position as 3 days earlier, wearing the same white tank top with the same beer stain on the front, making the same defensive gestures with his hands. Carlos launched into his familiar explanation without waiting for Ezra to speak. "She's crazy, man. I didn't touch her. She throws things at me and then calls the cops. Look at this mess. She did this, not me." But as Carlos spoke, Ezra noticed that the man's lips weren't quite synchronized with the words he was hearing. The speech seemed to be coming from somewhere else, as if Carlos was lip-syncing to a recording of his own voice from a previous encounter. As the interview continued, Ezra began to experience a profound sense of déjà vu that went beyond simple familiarity. He found himself anticipating not just what Carlos would say, but exactly when he would say it, precisely what gestures he would make, and how his emotional state would shift from anger to defensiveness to manipulative charm. When Carlos claimed that Maria had attacked him first, Ezra knew that the man would point to a small scratch on his left forearm at exactly the moment he did it. When Carlos insisted that he only had 2 beers, Ezra could predict that he would immediately contradict himself by mentioning the 6-pack he had shared with his cousin. The realization that he was living through an exact repetition of a previous encounter filled Ezra with a growing sense of claustrophobia and panic. He tried to deviate from his usual routine, asking different questions, approaching the situation from a new angle, but every attempt to change the course of events seemed to slide back into the familiar pattern. When he asked Maria if she had somewhere safe to stay for the night, she gave him the same response about her sister in Coral Gables that she'd given him 3 days earlier. When he offered Carlos information about anger management classes, the man responded with the identical mixture of interest and skepticism that he had shown before. The most chilling moment came when Ezra walked back to his patrol car to file his report. As he opened his laptop and began typing, he discovered that the report was already written, complete with timestamps, case numbers, and narrative details that matched exactly what had just occurred. The document had been created 3 days earlier, but it described tonight's events with perfect accuracy, down to the specific words used by both Maria and Carlos during their interviews. Even more disturbing, the report contained Ezra's own thoughts and observations, written in his own style, describing his growing awareness that he was trapped in some kind of temporal loop. Ezra tried calling his supervisor to report the anomaly, but the call went directly to voicemail, and the message he heard was his own voice from 3 days earlier, leaving an identical report about the same situation. When he attempted to drive away from the scene, his patrol car seemed to move through the streets in a predetermined pattern, following the exact route he had taken after his previous visit to. Let's move to our 7th story, and what dispatch operator Luna McCarthy encountered in the communications center of Denver PD will make you question whether the voices calling for help are from our time or echoing across decades from the dead. Luna had been working the night shift in the downtown dispatch center for 9 years, serving as the crucial link between desperate callers and the officers who might save their lives. She prided herself on her ability to remain calm during the most chaotic emergencies, to extract critical information from panicked voices, and to coordinate complex multi-unit responses across a city where every minute could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. Her colleagues respected her for her encyclopedic knowledge of Denver's street grid, her intuitive ability to read the emotional state of callers, and her uncanny skill at keeping officers safe by anticipating dangers before they manifested. The communications center occupied the third floor of the public safety building on Bannock Street, a fortress-like structure built in the 1980s with thick concrete walls designed to withstand natural disasters and terrorist attacks. Luna's workstation was positioned in the center of a room filled with dozens of other dispatchers, all working under the constant glow of multiple computer monitors displaying real-time maps, unit locations, and incident reports. The cacophony of radio chatter, ringing phones, and keyboard typing created a white noise that most dispatchers learned to filter out. But Luna had always been able to isolate individual voices from the chaos, to hear the subtle variations in tone and inflection that revealed when a routine call was about to become something far more dangerous. On the night of December 15, 2021, Luna was working her usual 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift when she received a 911 call that initially seemed rooted, but quickly revealed itself to be something that challenged her understanding of reality itself. The call came in at 2:34 a.m., showing on her display as originating from a payphone at the intersection of Colfax Avenue and Federal Boulevard, a location Luna knew well because it was a frequent source of drug-related incidents and domestic disturbances. The caller identification system showed no name, just a phone number that Luna recognized from dozens of previous calls over the years. When Luna answered the call with her standard greeting, "911, what is your emergency?" she heard a voice that made her blood freeze in her veins. The caller was a police officer, clearly in distress, reporting that he and his partner were trapped inside a burning building with multiple civilians who needed immediate rescue. The officer's voice was strained with smoke inhalation and panic, but Luna could hear him trying to maintain professional composure as he provided his badge number, his location, and the nature of the emergency. What made the call so disturbing was that Luna recognized the voice immediately. The officer was Detective Michael O'Brien, badge number 2847, who had been killed in a line-of-duty incident in 1987, more than 30 years before Luna had even begun working for Denver PD. O'Brien had died in a warehouse fire in the Five Points neighborhood while attempting to rescue a family trapped on the second floor of a building that had been set ablaze by arsonists. Luna knew the story because O'Brien's photograph hung in the memorial hall at the public safety building, and his case was still cited in training materials as an example of heroic sacrifice in the line of duty. But the voice on the phone was unmistakably O'Brien's, and he was describing the warehouse fire in real time, as if it was happening at that very moment, rather than decades in the past. O'Brien was requesting immediate fire department response, paramedics, and additional police units to assist with crowd control and traffic management around the scene. His radio traffic was crackling with static, and Luna could hear the background noise of crackling flames, shouting voices, and the creaking of structural timber beginning to fail under extreme heat. Luna's training took over despite her shock and confusion. She began dispatching fire units and paramedics to the address O'Brien had provided, but when she checked the location on her computer system, she discovered that the warehouse had been demolished in 1994 and replaced with a community center that showed no signs of fire or emergency activity. The units she dispatched arrived at the scene to find a quiet neighborhood with no smoke, no flames, and no signs of any emergency situation. But on her radio, Luna could still hear O'Brien's voice, growing more desperate as he described the fire spreading and civilians beginning to succumb to smoke inhalation. As the call continued, Luna began to receive additional radio traffic from other officers who had supposedly responded to assist O'Brien. She heard the voices of Detective Patricia Williams, Sergeant James Rodriguez, and Officer Susan Chen, all providing updates on their attempts to coordinate the rescue operation and evacuate the burning building. But Luna's computer showed that Williams had retired in 2003, Rodriguez had been killed in a car accident in 1998, and Chen had never existed in Denver PD's personnel records. She was listening to a coordinated emergency response from officers who were dead, retired, or entirely fictional. The most chilling aspect of the situation was that the radio traffic was perfectly synchronized and professionally executed. The officers were following proper protocols, using correct radio procedures, and coordinating their efforts with the kind of precision that only comes from years of experience working together. Their voices showed appropriate levels of stress and urgency for the situation they were describing, and their tactical decisions reflected sound judgment and extensive training. If Luna hadn't known that most of the officers were dead, she would have considered it a textbook example of effective emergency response. As Luna listened to the ghost radio traffic, she began to notice that O'Brien was providing updates about the fire that were historically accurate to the 1987 incident. He described the same number of trapped civilians that had been documented in the official incident report, mentioned the same structural hazards that had ultimately led to his death, and even referenced specific pieces of equipment that Denver Fire Department had been using in the 1980s, but had since replaced with more modern gear. It was as if Luna was receiving a live broadcast from 1987, transmitted through time to reach her radio console in 2021. Luna tried to communicate directly with O'Brien, to warn him about the structural collapse that was about to occur and tell him to evacuate the building immediately. But her transmission seemed to be reaching him with a significant delay, as if her voice was traveling through decades of time before arriving at his radio. When she warned him about the danger, O'Brien would acknowledge her transmission several minutes later, but by then the situation had already progressed beyond the point where her warnings could be effective. The temporal communication became even more disturbing when Luna realized that O'Brien was receiving information from his own future. He began to make tactical decisions that demonstrated knowledge of how the fire would spread, which civilians would be found in which locations, and which escape routes would remain viable longest. He was coordinating the rescue operation with information that he couldn't possibly have possessed in 1987, as if Luna's warnings were somehow reaching him and influencing his actions in the past. As the radio traffic continued, Luna began to hear her own voice joining the conversation. A version of herself from what appeared to be 1987 was coordinating the emergency response, dispatching units, and providing updates to the officers on scene. But the 1987 Luna was using radio codes and procedures that hadn't been adopted by Denver PD until the 1990s, and she was referencing street names and landmarks that had changed since the warehouse fire occurred. It was as if multiple timelines were converging in the radio traffic, creating an impossible conversation between past and present versions of the same people. The situation reached its climax when Luna heard O'Brien's final transmission, the last words he had spoken before the warehouse roof collapsed and killed him in 1987. But this time, instead of the desperate final call for help that was documented in the historical record, O'Brien's voice was calm and resigned. He thanked Luna for her assistance, told her that he understood what was happening, and warned her that she would continue to receive calls from officers who had died in the line of duty until she learned to accept that some voices never stop calling for help. Just before the transmission ended, O'Brien told Luna something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her job and her own fate. He said that Luna, herself, had died years earlier, on a night when she had stayed late to help coordinate a massive emergency response, and that she had been working as a ghost dispatcher ever since, taking calls from dead officers and coordinating rescues that existed only in the space between life and death. According to O'Brien, the entire night shift at the dispatch center was staffed by operators who had died at their posts, continuing to work because they couldn't accept that their time to help people had ended. Luna looked around the communication center and realized that she couldn't remember the last time she had seen any of her colleagues leave at the end of their shifts. She couldn't recall eating meals, taking breaks, or even feeling tired during her long nights at the radio console. She had no memory of driving to work or returning home, no recollection of conversations with supervisors or interactions with other departments. Her entire existence seemed to consist of sitting at her workstation, taking emergency calls and dispatching units to respond to crises that might or might not be occurring in the present moment. The computer system showed that Luna had been logged into her workstation continuously for months, without any breaks or time off, which should have been impossible under department policy and labor regulations. Her personnel file indicated that she had been killed in a car accident while driving home from work in 2019. But somehow she had continued reporting for duty every night since then, taking calls and coordinating responses as if nothing had changed. As Luna processed this revelation, she began to receive more calls from dead officers, each one describing emergencies that had occurred years or decades in the past, but were somehow still in progress in whatever temporal space they occupied. She heard from officers who had been killed in shootouts, car accidents, and natural disasters, all of them requesting assistance with cases that had been closed long before Luna had begun working for the department. But she also began to understand that her role was not to dispatch living officers to real emergencies, but to provide comfort and coordination to the spirits of officers who had died while trying to help others and couldn't accept that their duty had ended. Luna realized that she had become part of a supernatural support system, a communications network that connected the living and the dead through radio waves that traveled not just through space, but through time itself. She was the voice that answered when dead officers called for help, the dispatcher who coordinated rescue operations that existed only in the memories and regrets of those who had died, trying to save others. Her job was to ensure that no call for help went unanswered, even if the caller had been dead for decades and the emergency had been resolved long ago. Luna McCarthy continues to work the night shift at Denver PD's Communications Center, though whether she is alive or dead remains unclear even to her. She takes calls from officers across multiple timelines, dispatches units that may or may not exist, and coordinates emergency responses that blur the line between past and present, life and death. She has learned to accept that some duties transcend mortality, that some voices will never stop calling for help, and that the thin blue line extends beyond the grave to connect all those who have dedicated their lives to protecting others. On quiet nights, when the radio traffic is light and the city seems peaceful, Luna sometimes hears her own voice calling for help from some future emergency, and she wonders if someday she will be the one reaching across time to warn another dispatcher about dangers they cannot yet see, adding her voice to the eternal chorus of those who died trying to keep others safe and can never truly rest until every call for help has been answered. Let's move to our 8th story, and what Officer Atlas Kovac experienced in the fog-shrouded streets of Boston's North End will make you question the fundamental nature of identity and whether the person staring back at you in the mirror is truly yourself. Atlas had been walking the beat in Boston's historic district for 12 years, patrolling cobblestone streets that had witnessed 3 centuries of crime, revolution, and human drama. He was known throughout the department for his methodical approach to investigations, his encyclopedic knowledge of the North End's labyrinthine alleyways, and his uncanny ability to spot trouble before it erupted into violence. These qualities made what happened to him on the fog-drenched night of October 31st, 2020, all the more terrifying, because Atlas Kovac was not someone who lost track of reality, who confused shadows with substance, or who let his imagination transform routine patrol work into nightmare scenarios. The call came in at 1:47 a.m. as a possible breaking and entering at Benedetto's Antique Mirrors, a narrow shop squeezed between a cannoli bakery and a funeral home on Salem Street. The business had been operating in the same location since 1923, run by 3 generations of the Benedetto family who specialized in restoring antique mirrors, picture frames, and decorative glass pieces that wealthy collectors and historical societies commissioned them to preserve. Atlas had walked past the shop thousands of times during his patrols, occasionally glancing through the windows at the ornate mirrors that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, creating an endless maze of reflections that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the small storefront. The Halloween fog had rolled in from Boston Harbor just after midnight, transforming the familiar streets into something from a Gothic novel. Visibility was reduced to less than 20 feet, and the antique street lamps created pools of amber light that seemed to float in the grey void like isolated islands of illumination. The narrow streets that Atlas knew by heart became disorienting corridors where sound bounced off invisible walls, and every footstep echoed with supernatural resonance. Even the familiar sounds of the city, traffic humming on the nearby interstate, late-night revelers stumbling home from bars, the distant foghorns from the harbor, seemed muffled and distorted by the thick maritime air. When Atlas arrived at Benedetto's, he found the front door standing ajar, which was unusual, but not necessarily suspicious, given that the elderly owner, Giuseppe Benedetto, sometimes forgot to secure the shop properly when closing for the evening. Atlas called out to announce his presence, but received no response from within the darkened interior. Using his flashlight to illuminate the narrow entrance, he could see that the alarm system had not been activated and there were no obvious signs of forced entry or vandalism. The shop appeared exactly as it always did, with dozens of mirrors of various sizes and periods arranged along the walls, creating a disorienting gallery of reflections that multiplied every beam of light into a constellation of dancing illuminations. As Atlas stepped inside to conduct a security check, he immediately noticed something that made him pause and examine his surroundings more carefully. His reflection in the mirrors lining the walls was not behaving normally. While Atlas moved forward into the shop, his reflection in a large Victorian mirror near the entrance appeared to be moving backward, retreating deeper into the glass, as if it was trying to distance itself from the real Atlas. At first he attributed this to the fog and poor lighting creating optical illusions, but as he continued his inspection, the discrepancy became more pronounced and more impossible to rationalize. In an ornate Baroque mirror positioned behind the main counter, Atlas's reflection was not wearing his police uniform at all, but appeared to be dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a dark sweater that he didn't own. The reflection's facial expression was different too, showing a mixture of fear and confusion that didn't match Atlas's calm, professional demeanor as he conducted his routine security check. Most disturbing of all, when Atlas raised his hand to test whether the reflection would mirror his movements, the reflection raised its opposite hand, as if it was not copying his actions, but responding to them independently. Atlas tried to rationalize what he was seeing by considering the possibility that the antique mirrors had warped or distorted glass that was creating unusual visual effects. Antique mirrors often developed imperfections over time that could distort reflections in strange ways, and the combination of fog, artificial lighting, and his own fatigue might be causing him to misinterpret what he was seeing. But as he moved deeper into the shop, examining each mirror systematically, he realized that every single reflection was showing him something different than what he expected to see. In a round Art Deco mirror hanging near the back of the shop, Atlas's reflection appeared to be bleeding from a head wound, with dark liquid streaming down the side of his face and staining his uniform shirt. But when Atlas touched his own head, he felt no injury, no wetness, no pain. In an antique hand mirror displayed on a velvet-lined table, his reflection appeared to be much older, showing deep wrinkles around his eyes and grey hair that he didn't possess. The reflection was mouthing words that Atlas couldn't hear, appearing to be trying to communicate some urgent message across the barrier between reality and reflection. The most chilling discovery came when Atlas examined a full-length mirror that dominated the rear wall of the shop. His reflection in this mirror was not alone. It was accompanied by the reflection of another police officer, someone Atlas didn't recognize, but who appeared to be his partner in whatever reality the mirror was displaying. The unknown officer was gesturing urgently, pointing towards something that Atlas couldn't see in the real world, trying to warn his partner about some danger that existed only in the reflected dimension. As Atlas stared at this impossible scene, his reflection suddenly made direct eye contact with him, breaking the normal rules that governed mirrors and reflections. The reflected Atlas appeared to be aware that he was being observed by his real-world counterpart, and he began to move with deliberate intention rather than simply mimicking Atlas's movements. The reflection pointed directly at the real Atlas, then pointed to himself, then made a cutting gesture across his throat, a universal signal indicating mortal danger. Atlas tried to step away from the mirror, but found that his movements were becoming synchronized with his reflection in ways that defied physics and logic. When his reflection moved to the left, Atlas found himself compelled to move to the right, as if they were connected by invisible strings that forced them to mirror each other's actions. When his reflection drew its service weapon, Atlas felt his own hand moving toward his holster without his conscious control. The boundary between the real Atlas and the reflected Atlas was becoming increasingly blurred, and Atlas began to fear that he was losing control of his own body. The situation escalated when Atlas heard the sound of another person entering the shop behind him. He turned to see a figure approaching through the fog-filled doorway, but when he looked back at the mirrors, his reflection was still facing forward, still engaged in its silent conversation with the unknown partner. The person entering the shop appeared to be another police officer, someone wearing an identical uniform, carrying identical equipment, and moving with Atlas's distinctive gait and posture. But this duplicate Atlas was not a reflection. It was a three-dimensional person who cast his own shadow and made his own sounds as he walked across the creaking wooden floor. The duplicate Atlas approached with a professional demeanor, introducing himself as Officer Atlas Kovac, badge number 4721, and explaining that he had received a call about a possible break-in at this location. The duplicate Atlas appeared to have no awareness that he was speaking to another version of himself, treating the encounter as if he was meeting a fellow officer for the first time. He asked Atlas for his identification and wanted to know what he had discovered during his search of the premises, following standard protocol for coordinating with other units at a crime scene. But when Atlas looked at the mirrors surrounding them, he saw that his reflection was now mimicking the movements of the duplicate Atlas, while the duplicate's reflection was mimicking his own movements. They had somehow switched places in the reflected world, with each officer's reflection now corresponding to the other's physical actions. The duplicate Atlas appeared to be unaware of this impossible exchange, continuing to treat the situation as routine police work. But Atlas realized that something fundamental about their identities had been altered by their presence in the mirror-filled shop. As the two versions of Atlas continued their conversation, Atlas began to notice subtle differences between himself and his duplicate. The duplicate's voice was slightly different in pitch and inflection. His facial expressions were more animated than Atlas's typically reserved demeanor, and his body language suggested someone who was more outgoing and social than Atlas had ever been. The duplicate Atlas mentioned details about his personal life: a wife named Sarah, 2 children, a house in Jamaica Plain, that didn't match Atlas's actual circumstances as a lifelong bachelor who lived alone in a South End apartment. The realization began to dawn on Atlas that he might not be the original version of himself at all. The duplicate Atlas seemed more natural, more confident, more at ease in his own skin than Atlas felt. The duplicate's memories of the job, his knowledge of department procedures, and his familiarity with the North End beat seemed more complete and detailed than Atlas's own recollections. Atlas began to wonder if he was actually the reflection that had somehow escaped from the mirrors, while the duplicate was the real Atlas Kovac, who belonged in the three-dimensional world. The mystery deepened when Atlas examined his own identification and discovered discrepancies that he had never noticed before. His badge number, which he had carried for 12 years, showed signs of recent manufacture rather than the wear and patting that should have accumulated over more than a decade of daily use. His department ID photo looked slightly off, as if it had been altered or reproduced rather than taken directly. Even his fingerprints, when he pressed them against a dusty mirror surface, left marks that seemed somehow less substantial than the duplicate's fingerprints on the same surface. Let's move to our ninth and final story, the most disturbing of all, because what Captain Isabella Cross discovered during her last week of active duty will make you question whether your entire life's work, every decision you've made, every moment of meaning you've created, was orchestrated by forces beyond your comprehension. Isabella had dedicated 30 years to Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, rising through the ranks from patrol officer to captain through sheer determination, impeccable judgment, and an almost supernatural ability to solve the cases that stumped everyone else. She was the department's most decorated officer, credited with closing more than 200 major cases, preventing countless crimes, and building a reputation that extended far beyond the neon-soaked streets of Sin City. As she prepared for her retirement ceremony in March 2023, Isabella expected to look back on a career defined by justice served and lives saved. Instead, she discovered that every triumph, every breakthrough, every moment of professional pride had been orchestrated by an intelligence that had been manipulating her life for decades. The revelation began during what should have been routine paperwork, the final case review required before Isabella could officially retire and receive her full pension. Department policy mandated that departing senior officers conduct a comprehensive analysis of their most significant cases, identifying patterns, documenting lessons learned, and providing insights that could benefit future investigations. Isabella approached this task with the same methodical precision that had defined her career, expecting to spend a few days reviewing familiar case files and writing summaries that would gather dust in administrative archives. But as Isabella examined her cases chronologically, starting with her first arrest as a rookie patrol officer in 1993, she began to notice patterns that defied probability and logic. Every major case she had solved featured the same mysterious figure appearing in security footage, witness statements, or background investigations, always in peripheral roles, never as a primary suspect or victim, but present nonetheless. The figure appeared to be a middle-aged woman with distinctive silver hair and piercing blue eyes, someone who showed up as a hotel clerk who provided crucial information, a witness who saw something important, or a bystander who made anonymous tips that broke cases wide open. What made this pattern so disturbing was that the woman appeared to be the same age in footage spanning 3 decades. In security camera recordings from 1993, she looked approximately 50 years old. In digital surveillance from 2023, she appeared to be exactly the same age, with the same facial features, the same mannerisms, and the same uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time to ensure that Isabella's investigations succeeded. The woman had somehow remained unchanged by the passage of 30 years, aging neither forward nor backward, while consistently appearing at the crucial moments that defined Isabella's career. Isabella's most famous case, the one that had earned her national recognition and promotion to captain, was the 2008 Bellagio casino heist, where armed robbers had stolen millions in cash and chips during a high-stakes poker tournament. Isabella had cracked the case by noticing a discrepancy in the casino's employee scheduling records, leading to the arrest of 3 inside conspirators who had planned the robbery for months. But reviewing the case files now, Isabella discovered that the scheduling anomaly had been pointed out to her by a hotel human resources manager named Elena Voss, a woman who perfectly matched the description of the mysterious figure, who appeared in all her other cases. The more Isabella researched Elena Voss, the more impossible her existence became. The woman had somehow held jobs at dozens of different businesses throughout Las Vegas over the past 30 years, always in positions that gave her access to information relevant to Isabella's investigations. She had worked as a bank teller during Isabella's investigation of mortgage fraud, as a hospital administrator during her work on medical malpractice cases, as a school secretary during her pursuit of a predator targeting children, and as a city clerk during her investigation of municipal corruption. Elena Voss had been perfectly positioned to provide Isabella with exactly the information she needed to solve every major case of her career. But when Isabella tried to contact Elena Voss directly, she discovered that the woman had no verifiable existence outside of her appearances in Isabella's case files. There were no DMV records, no social security information, no tax filings, no credit history, and no permanent address associated with the name Elena Voss. The businesses where she had allegedly worked had no employment records for anyone by that name, and the supervisors who should have remembered her had no recollection of ever hiring or working with such a person. Elena Voss existed only in the documentation related to Isabella's cases, as if she had been inserted into reality solely for the purpose of ensuring Isabella's success. The psychological impact of this discovery was devastating. Isabella realized that her greatest professional achievements might not have been the result of her own skill, intuition, or dedication, but rather the product of systematic manipulation by an entity that had been guiding her career for decades. Every breakthrough that had filled her with pride, every moment of satisfaction when she brought criminals to justice, every commendation and promote. Iron she had earned might have been predetermined outcomes rather than genuine accomplishments. As Isabella delved deeper into the mystery, she began to find evidence that the manipulation extended far beyond her professional life. Elena Voss had also appeared at crucial moments in Isabella's personal life, always in background roles that influenced major decisions without Isabella realizing it. The real estate agent who helped Isabella buy her first house had been Elena Voss. The admissions counselor who encouraged Isabella to enroll in the criminal justice program that launched her law enforcement career had been Elena Voss. The marriage counselor who helped Isabella navigate her divorce had been Elena Voss. The woman had been orchestrating every significant moment of Isabella's life for 30 years, ensuring that each decision led Isabella further down the path toward becoming the most successful detective in Las Vegas. The revelation that her entire adult life had been subject to invisible manipulation filled Isabella with a rage and despair that threatened to destroy everything she had believed about herself and her accomplishments. She considered the possibility that she was experiencing a psychological breakdown brought on by pre-retirement anxiety, but the evidence was too consistent, too detailed, and too impossible to dismiss as delusion or coincidence. Elena Voss was real. She had been manipulating Isabella's life for decades, and her motivations remained completely mysterious. Isabella's investigation took a darker turn when she discovered that Elena Voss had appeared in the case files of other retired Las Vegas police officers, always playing similar background roles that ensured their success in major investigations. The woman had been orchestrating the careers of multiple officers simultaneously, creating a web of manipulation that extended throughout the department's history. But when Isabella tried to contact these other officers to discuss their experiences with Elena Voss, she learned that many of them had died under mysterious circumstances shortly after their retirement, often in accidents or from sudden illnesses that had no apparent cause. The pattern of deaths among retired officers who had been successful in their careers created a terrifying possibility. Elena Voss was not just manipulating their professional success, but was also eliminating them once their usefulness had expired. Isabella realized that her own retirement might not be the peaceful conclusion to a successful career that she had anticipated, but could instead be the beginning of a countdown toward her own elimination by forces she didn't understand and couldn't control. As Isabella struggled to comprehend the scope of the conspiracy surrounding her life, she received an unexpected visitor at her office on her final day of active duty. Elena Voss walked through the door as if she belonged there, looking exactly as she had in security footage from 30 years earlier, and introduced herself formally for the first time. Elena explained that she was not a person in the conventional sense, but rather a temporal agent tasked with ensuring that specific outcomes occurred within the timeline of human history. According to Elena's explanation, Isabella's successful career had prevented numerous catastrophic events from occurring in Las Vegas and beyond. Every case Isabella had solved, every criminal she had arrested, and every crime she had prevented had been necessary steps in maintaining the stability of reality itself. Elena claimed that without Isabella's intervention in these specific cases, alternative timelines would have developed where much worse outcomes occurred. Terrorist attacks that killed thousands, serial killers who were never caught, corrupt officials who destroyed entire communities. Elena revealed that Isabella's life had been carefully orchestrated, not to serve some malicious purpose, but to ensure that she became the person capable of preventing these larger disasters. Every success, every promotion, and every moment of professional growth had been designed to position Isabella to make the decisions that would save lives and preserve the stability of the timeline. The manipulation had been extensive and lifelong, but its purpose had been to transform Isabella into a hero whose actions had consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. Alternatively, Isabella could choose to reject this role and return to normal human existence, but doing so would erase all memory of her manipulated experiences and reduce her to the person she would have been without Eleanor's intervention, someone far less successful, far less accomplished, and far less capable of making a positive impact on the world. The choice was between embracing a larger purpose that required deception and manipulation, or accepting a smaller, more authentic existence that would undo 30 years of professional achievement. Isabella stared at Elena Voss, this mysterious figure who had shaped every important moment of her adult life, and realized that the decision she made would not just determine her own future, but would also establish whether the cycle of manipulation would continue with other officers, other cases, and other lives orchestrated from the shadows. She had to choose between being a victim of manipulation who becomes a manipulator herself, or breaking the cycle and accepting the consequences of authentic but limited existence. A message to remember. As we reach the end of these 9 disturbing testimonies, I want you to understand something crucial about what you've just experienced. These officers, Marcus, Sarah, Tommy, Dakota, Priya, Ezra, Luna, Atlas, and Isabella, represent more than just victims of impossible circumstances. They represent the terrifying fragility of everything we take for granted. Our memories, our identity, our perception of time, our trust in reality itself. But here's what I need you to understand. The real horror isn't in what happened to them. The real horror is in recognizing that each of us lives one decision away from questioning everything we believe about our own lives. How do you know your memories are real? How can you be certain that the people around you are who they claim to be? What evidence do you have that your own accomplishments are truly your own? These stories should serve as a wake-up call. In a world where we're increasingly disconnected from genuine human experience, where we live through screens and surrender our attention to algorithms designed to manipulate our behavior, we're all vulnerable to the kind of reality distortion these officers experienced. The difference is that their manipulation was supernatural. Ours is entirely human, entirely preventable, and entirely happening right now. Every day you spend scrolling mindlessly, consuming content created to influence your decisions, accepting information without verification, you're surrendering pieces of your authentic self. You're allowing your reality to be shaped by forces you don't understand, just like these officers were shaped by forces beyond their comprehension. Your mission starts now. Here's what you need to do, and I mean right now, before you click away and forget this moment. First, put down your phone after this video ends. Look around your immediate physical environment. 2. Touch 3 objects near you. Say your own name out loud. Ground yourself in the tangible reality that exists beyond screens and stories. Second, question everything you've accepted without investigation. Start with one belief you hold strongly but have never personally verified. Research it from primary sources. Experience it directly. Stop living secondhand. Third, subscribe to XYZ Terminal right now if you haven't already, because we're the only channel committed to showing you reality without filters, without manipulation, without the comfortable lies that keep you passive. Hit that notification bell because the truth doesn't wait for convenient moments. Fourth, share this video, but not just to entertain your friends. Share it with someone who needs to wake up from their own manipulated reality. Be the Elena Voss of truth-telling instead of deception. And finally, promise yourself that you'll remember this feeling, this unsettling awareness that reality might not be what it seems. Don't let it fade into comfortable forgetfulness. Let it drive you to live more consciously, more authentically, more aware of the forces trying to shape your thoughts and decisions. The officers in these stories couldn't escape their situations because they were dealing with supernatural forces. But you have the power to escape the entirely human forces that are manipulating your reality right now. The question is, will you use that power, or will you let yourself drift back into comfortable unconsciousness? The choice is yours, but remember, once you've heard the truth, you can never truly unhear it. And once you know that reality can be manipulated, you can never again assume that yours isn't being shaped by forces you haven't recognized yet. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, and stay subscribed to XYZ Terminal, because in a world full of comfortable lies, we're committed to bringing you the uncomfortable truth. Your real life starts the moment you take control of it back.